Hi everyone, it's Paula MacLean again, and I am back with the Great Boards video course. This module is all about board succession, recruitment, and orientation. So I'm going to start with this lesson with the whole idea of which size should our board be, how do we find out what size it should be, and some stuff about term limits that is probably going to drive a lot of your recruitment activity going forward. Let me just make a point to start off to say that succession planning on a board level is absolutely not optional. Boards get into trouble when they have either no turnover or too much turnover. So making sure we've got good leadership and we've got succession planning for the leadership positions, but also for the board as a whole, is absolutely essential. Now, boards obviously need new ideas. So we don't want to have kind of the fall prey to years and years and years of groupthink, or what's often called founder syndrome, where we have the same board members who started the organization continuing on for sometimes decades and decades. Sometimes we even have the executive director who supported the creation of the organization. So that's another layer of founder syndrome. So we want to make sure that we have some turnover, but if we have too much turnover, then that can cause loss of group memory. We can end up reinventing the wheel because the people that created something for us, we forgot that they did it, and so we have to redo it. So too much turnover is arguably not a good thing either. So really what we want to do is we want to create a balance between new ideas and fresh board members and new blood, and ongoing stability and retention of the group memory, and making sure that we retain the good practices that have been created over a period of years. You know, old practices like the whole idea of in order to get off the board you have to be able to recruit somebody to replace yourself, they have to die. And I still see periodically organizations using that practice. It's kind of the default go-to practice when a board does not have good recruitment practices or policies in their governance policies. And so that says that a friend of a friend of a friend always ends up being who the new board member will be. Not a good practice for a number of reasons, and we can just do so much better. So I'm going to share with you some of the strategies that we need to put together. Now, the first thing that I want to tell you is that we should not be doing recruitment in the days or weeks that are the run-up to the annual meeting, where we have to put our new slate of board members and officers forward to our membership. Now, I just want to acknowledge that many organizations don't have large memberships, and then your board of directors is in fact your membership. Other organizations have small memberships, number of people that are kind of like-minded. You might have 10, 15, 20, or 30 members, and that's fine. Those are the people who then come to the annual meeting and elect the new board. And there are some organizations that are very much membership driven. So you can have hundreds or even thousands of memberships. Some national organizations have tens of thousands of memberships across the country. So we really want to think about our membership and think about who we draw from our members if we have one. If we don't have one, which is more commonly the case, if we don't have a membership, it's going to be the board who are the members, and therefore the board that have to work at planning for its own succession to be put into place. So what we don't want to do is to do a kind of a last-minute recruitment. This is often where the executive director ends up doing the recruitment for the board. You've already heard me talk about the fact that that's not good practice, because it really does weaken the board, and it can really leave the board with the impression either that the executive director runs everything, which is never a good position to be in, or that the executive director is going to, you know, be the person who will always have your back. So therefore, if the board does nothing, the executive director will have to. And that's in fact true. Is the executive director has to report to a board. She or he has to have a group of people called a board of directors. It doesn't work if, you know, we're required to have a minimum of 5 members and we end up only with 3 or 4. And really what we want to do is get organized ahead of the game. I like it if boards create a nominating or recruitment committee or board development committee, whatever you want to call it, that is a year-round standing committee of the board. By far, recruitment is more important than many other practices that we end up creating standing committees for. So I'm going to say that recruitment because your lifeblood depends on it over a period of years into the future. Recruitment then deserves its own committee, and the standing committee is as part of a way of making sure that it gets the attention that it deserves. So none of this just kind of grab people off the street, warm bodies, who knows something, will they be on the board, etc. Lots of executive directors and boards complain about the level of engagement not being high enough. And a lot of the lack of engagement actually comes from the recruitment practices. We don't do it right by drawing people in who are committed to the organization, have the time to serve, want to be at the table, want to participate in the activities of the organization. If we don't do those things right at the front end, we end up suffering for lack of board engagement down the road. Next thing I want to talk about is that we need to have term limits, and I'm going to talk more about what is a term and what is a term limit, but we really need to have a way of saying, let's have an orderly rotation for the board to rejuvenate itself. People coming off the board, people going on to the board. And we need an executive succession plan as well. We need to think about who our executive is. The executive is often called the officers of the board, and the positions are usually the chair or the president of the board, the vice chair or the vice president, the secretary, and the treasurer. So we need a tighter kind of succession plan for those positions because the leadership of the board depends on it. There's nothing more chaotic for an executive director or staff group to say, well, I don't know who our board's going to be next year, and I don't know who the board chair is going to be, and the board hasn't quite figured that out yet, or the board hasn't even started to talk about it yet. That's a huge default of board responsibilities. You can get a lot of other things right, but if you don't get this part right, it will cause chaos inside your organization. So the board does this work, and it shouldn't be defaulted to the nonprofit's senior management team. And frankly, of all the questions that I ask and answer when I work with nonprofit boards, and I've worked with probably pretty close to 400 nonprofits from across the country in the last, I don't know, more than 20 years, is that if someone says to me, you know, we don't have a succession plan for our officers, for our executive of the board, that's a scary situation to be in because it basically says we could be without leadership. So attend to those kinds of details. Now let's talk about board size. Where do you get that number from? Well, it should be in your bylaws, and your bylaws should actually prescribe a range. Usually the range will be like between 5 and 12 members. Now, I was on a board of a national organization that had 25 members. They were all women. That was because the membership of the organization, to be a member, you had to be a woman. It was a disaster. The stuff that was going on, the lack of kind of clarity on what board governance was all about, and it took a number of years for the board to get itself figured out. It was, I think, very, very difficult on the executive director, although to my knowledge, she never complained. And so we really need to look at size of a board. There is a trend, and I'm talking now on the Canadian side of the 49th parallel, to smaller boards. And so we're moving away from that, 20, 25 board members and shrinking down into the range of 10 or a little bit under 10. You also need to remind yourself that there are state, provincial, federal laws that apply to your organization that may dictate the size of your board. The flexibility that you get from having a range is very important, and watch your bylaws or your governance policies wherever that is described or prescribed, your number of board members. You do not want a bylaw that says you must have 8 board members. That is so difficult to maintain, or 10 or 12 or 15. The actual number doesn't matter. It's the fact that it's a fixed number that's problematic. If you have that in your bylaws, go about changing that and get yourself a range. And so 8 is really hard to maintain. 10 is really hard to maintain because if one board member drops off, all of a sudden you're not legally constituted again. And I just want to tell you what that means. It means that when you make a motion, it may not be legally binding. It may not apply. It may not be real, in other words. So you can make and approve motions, but if you don't have exactly 8 members, because it's 8 that shows up in your bylaws, it's really problematic. So you want a range so that if you are between 5 and 12, for example, and you have 8, you're good to go. If you have all of a sudden 7 because somebody resigns, then you're still good to go. So very important that that range be something that you include in your bylaws. It also allows you to increase or decrease the number of board members that you have based on the activities of the organization. If you decide on a capital campaign, or if you have a brand new social enterprise that's about to launch, you need a few few more board members in order to engage them in the work of the creation of those kinds of major initiatives. If you're building a new building and you have, a great huge amount of people looking at architectural drawings and things where expertise of board members can be absolutely critical. So you want your architect and your engineer and your finance person on the board, and you want them on the committee called the building committee. So, being able to scale up your number of board members is absolutely essential to getting work done sometimes. And then if the organization is in a period of relative calm, not a lot of growth, not a lot of change, not a lot of problems that need to be managed, the board can get a little bit smaller, and smaller is always easier to coordinate board meetings, it's easier for communication. Don't get too tiny. 5 is often the rule of thumb guideline that we want for a minimum number of board members, and it's not uncommon to see that in the regulations coming from your provincial or state governments. So just to recap that, so you want to know what your projects are, what your strategic goals are, what the skill sets are that you need on your board, and then make the decision about how big your board should be for the year or two going forward. Another point I want to make is that if your board experiences a mid-term vacancy, a board member resigns, stops showing up, any of a number of things could happen, then it can be pretty important that you fill that vacancy right away. You don't want your board to get below its minimum, whatever that is, because then it's not legally constituted and could be challenged on the decisions that it's making. So you don't want to get too small, but the same token is you don't want the work to get spread, and I'm assuming an engaged board where the board does the work and contributes to the work of accomplishing the strategic objectives and writing governance policies and doing performance appraisals and so on. So you don't want to get too small because it really does burden some of your other volunteers who end up serving on too many committees and spending too many hours of their personal time serving the organization. So it's important to make sure that your governance policies or your bylaws allow you to fill a mid-term vacancy, and it's important if you have an active standing committee, whatever you call it, your recruitment or your nomination committee, that committee then kicks into gear and says, okay, we've got a vacancy. We are at 6 members. We need to fill our 7, and maybe we need 8 because we've got some plans afoot to make those things happen. So the committee should have the task. The bylaws should allow you to replace or fill vacancies during the year, and you don't have to wait till the end of the year and your next annual general meeting. Remember that falling below the legally constituted number is not a good thing. Right before I got into the studio to do this video, I answered an email from an executive director. They're in a tough situation. Their board they have a fixed number required in their bylaws, and they have been below that for more than a year, and now their funder is understanding that this is a problem, and this is not a good situation to be in. Now they're having to spend money on legal counsel. They booked some time with me to do some coaching to see what we can do to unstick the situation. And the board is a good board. They're nice people, but they have not stepped up and managed a problem that they have known about for quite a long time. This is not a situation you want to find yourself in. So just don't be passive in the whole notion of how we do board recruitment.